From the window on the 14th floor of the Empire Business Center, Richard Alvarez observed the city he had helped build. At 68 years old, his reflection in the bulletproof glass revealed a man whose wrinkles concealed a mind as sharp as a razor, his hands slightly trembling, not from fragility but from decades of manipulating numbers and people, held a cup of Colombian coffee. "Mr. Alvarez, the merger documents are ready for signature." Richard turned to his executive. Assistant Marta, a 45-year-old woman who had known his professional secrets for 2 decades. "Thank you, Marta. And how is the monitoring of the Silverstone situation?" "Exactly as you predicted. The diversions continue. Just in the last quarter, there were another $83,000. Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And no one suspects my involvement?" "No, sir. For all intents and purposes, you remain just the retired father-in-law who can barely operate a smartphone." A thin, cold smile formed on Richard's lips. "Perfect." That same night, Richard parked his old Corolla, a purposefully modest car, 3 blocks before the mansion where his son Daniel lived with Carolina and their grandchildren. He exchanged his Rolex for a cheap Timex, disheveled his grey hair, and put on a worn cardigan. The transformation was complete, from imposing magnate to fragile elderly man in minutes. Daniel Alvarez was sitting on the edge of the king-size bed, looking at the family portrait on the wall. His wife Carolina's smile shone in the photograph, the same smile that had won him over 12 years ago. The same smile he rarely saw now, except when she was in public or needed something. "Your father is coming. You know what to do." Carolina's voice cut through his thoughts, cold and sharp as always. "Carol, maybe we could..." "Could what, Daniel? Tell him about our financial problems? Ask the useless old man who can barely take care of himself for help." She adjusted her expensive dress, checking her appearance in the mirror. "You know very well that we depend on my job at Silverstone. Your career as an architect ended years ago." Daniel swallowed hard. His career hadn't ended, it had been suffocated. Sabotaged projects, mysteriously lost contacts, opportunities that inexplicably disappeared. Only years later would he understand that Carolina was behind it all. The doorbell rang. "Go answer your father, and remember, if he asks about business, we change the subject." Carolina paused at the bedroom door. "Oh, and don't forget to remind the children how they should behave." Grandpa, Sophia, 10 years old, ran to hug Richard, who opened a genuine smile, one of the few he allowed himself in that house. Lucas, at 14, kept his distance, looking at his smartphone. Richard noticed the warning look that Carolina gave her. Older grandson, who reluctantly put away his device and approached for a mechanical hug. "Lucas, how's the smartest boy in 9th grade?" Richard asked, observing his grandson's expression. "Fine, Grandpa," Lucas replied, glancing quickly at his mother. Richard noticed the dark circles under his grandson's eyes, the tense posture. The boy who once loved mathematics and chess now seemed only a shadow. "Dad, glad you came." Daniel appeared, his embrace sincere but tense. "Come, we made your favorite dish." Carolina entered the room, her artificial smile already in place. "Richard, good to see you. Did you manage to catch the bus alone this time?" Richard played his role to perfection. "Oh yes, dear, although I initially got off at the wrong stop. My memory, you know." The dining table was a work of art in fine wood, ironically purchased with money that Richard had secretly injected into his son's joint account. Carolina positioned herself at the head of the table, a symbolic place that Richard immediately noticed. "And how's retirement, Richard? Still playing dominoes with the other old folks in the neighborhood?" Carolina asked, serving herself red. "Wine? Oh yes, my days are peaceful. Sometimes I read the newspaper, take care of my plants." Richard replied, observing how Lucas rolled his eyes at his mother's discreet signal. "Grandpa, I got an A in math," Sophia interrupted, her eyes shining. "Wonderful, dear. Mathematics was always my passion too." Carolina cut off the interaction. "Sophia, don't interrupt adult conversations. And Richard, please don't encourage her with these math stories. She needs to focus on social skills, not numbers." The dinner proceeded with Carolina dominating the conversation, talking about her achievements at Silverstone Mining Group, about the trips she planned, about how tiring it was to support the entire family with her work. Richard absorbed every word, every detail, while helping Daniel wash the dishes, a task that Carolina insisted her husband should do. Richard casually asked, "Son, Silverstone is an interesting company. How exactly does Carolina's department work?" Daniel tensed up. "Dad, you know I don't understand much about these corporate matters, and honestly, Carol doesn't like me interfering in her work." Of course. Just an old man's curiosity." Richard smiled, but his eyes registered the fear on his son's face. Later, when Richard was preparing to leave, Carolina approached with an envelope. "Richard, I know your retirement barely covers your medications. Here's a little money." "It's not much, but it should help." Richard took the envelope, feigning gratitude. $300. "Oh, thank you very much, dear." What Carolina didn't know was that the money came indirectly from Richard himself, a tiny fraction of the funds he secretly controlled at Silverstone, the same company where she worked and from which she diverted hundreds of thousands. He left. Richard kissed his grandchildren and hugged his son. In the taxi heading home, not to the small apartment that Daniel and Carolina believed was his residence, but to the luxurious penthouse in the financial center, Richard made a call. "Marcelo, it's Richard. We need to intensify the investigation. The situation is worse than we imagined. The architecture of the masked Richard Alvarez hadn't always been a man of shadows. Born into a middle-class family, he graduated in mathematics with honors and taught for almost a decade before realizing the potential of emerging markets in the early 80s. His first big investment came from his father's modest inheritance, $20,000 invested in a small mining company that had discovered a silver deposit in the north of the country. In 5 years, that investment multiplied tenfold. Richard reinvested, expanded, diversified. At 45, he was already the majority shareholder of 2 technology companies and a silent partner in 3 others. His wife, Maria, had been his safe harbor during the construction of this empire, until an aggressive cancer took her away when Daniel was only 15 years old. "Dad, I don't understand why we live in this simple house if you have so much money," teenage Daniel questioned after his mother's funeral. Richard, looking at the horizon from the porch, had responded with wisdom that Daniel would only understand. Years later, "Son, visible wealth attracts envy. Invisible wealth builds empires." This philosophy shaped not only his business, but his personal life. When Daniel met Carolina during architecture school, Richard immediately noticed something in the young woman's calculating gaze, something familiar to him. The same look he had seen in so many ruthless negotiators, in so many corporate opportunists. "Does she love you or what she thinks you have?" Richard had asked his son after the first dinner with Carolina. "Dad, you're being unfair. Carolina is authentic, independent. She doesn't even know about our money." And indeed, Carolina didn't. No, because Richard had created the perfect illusion. The comfortable but modest house, the middle-class car, the affordable but not luxurious vacations. To the outside world, including Carolina, Richard was just a successful former teacher living on conservative investments and an adequate retirement. When Daniel announced the engagement, Richard made a decision that would change the course of their lives. He transferred 85% of his assets to bulletproof corporate structures, keeping only enough to live comfortably, but without ostentation. Simultaneously, he initiated a gradual diminishment operation. He began to appear slightly more fragile, more dependent, less sharp. On the wedding day, while dancing with his daughter-in-law, Richard whispered in her ear, "Take good care of my son, Carolina. He's all I have." She had responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry, Richard, we're a family now." In the early years, Carolina maintained the facade of a loving daughter-in-law, but as she realized that her father-in-law was not as wealthy as she had initially imagined, her mask began to fall. March of 2015, Richard would turn 58. Sitting in his penthouse, he watched the recordings from the discreet cameras he had installed in some rooms of his son's house. An extreme measure, he knew, but necessary for his investigation. On the screen he saw Carolina answering the phone. "No, we can't go. It's my useless father-in-law's birthday. Daniel insists on making dinner for the old man. Yes, I know. As if we had money to spend on this. I have to support a failed husband and now pay for parties for an old man who isn't even dead yet." Richard turned up the volume. Can you believe he asked if he could live with us, as if Daniel wasn't already a dead weight on my career? "No, of course," I said. "No. I said the house is too small. The truth is, I can't stand looking at that wrinkled face every day." Richard turned off the monitor, his expression impassive. That night, when he arrived at the surprise party that Daniel had organized, he hugged Carolina like a loving and grateful father-in-law. "You are a blessing to this family, my dear," he said, observing the slight discomfort in her eyes. As he blew out the candles, Richard made a silent wish. Patience. Revenge, like his investments, required time to mature. The Price of Invisibility, autumn of 2018. Richard observed from a distance as Lucas, then 7 years old, cried in the playground. The boy had built an impressive structure with magnetic blocks, a mathematical and spatial ability he had inherited from his grandfather, when Carolina approached. "Lucas, put that away. I've told you I don't want you playing with these nerdy things. Go play soccer like the other boys," the boy protested. "But Mom, Grandpa gave me these blocks," and Carolina's hand grabbed her son's arm with enough force to leave marks. "Your grandfather is a senile old man who can barely tie his own shoes. Do you want to be like him, a useless dependent on others?" Richard felt his heart tighten, every humiliation directed at him he could bear. But seeing his grandchildren being manipulated and hurt was almost unbearable. That night, he convened an extraordinary meeting with his lawyers. "I want to transfer 10% of my Silverstone shares to an educational fund in my grandchildren's names," he instructed. "But with one condition: the funds will only be accessible when they turn 25 or if, for any reason, they come under Daniel's exclusive custody." His lawyer, Dr. Martins, frowned. "Richard, that seems like a very specific prediction." "It's not a prediction, Martins. It's strategic planning. The following years saw the systematic deterioration of the family relationship. Carolina rising at Silverstone thanks to a combination of manipulation, hard work, and, as Richard would discover, accounting fraud, became increasingly cruel in her interactions with her father-in-law. On Christmas of 2019, during the family dinner, Carolina served Richard a different plate from the others. "It's a special diet for the elderly, Richard. Low sodium, gluten-free, fun-free." She laughed, winking at Lucas, who uncomfortably tried to join in his mother's laughter. "Mommy, why does Grandpa have to eat this? It looks like baby food," Sophia innocently asked. "Because your grandfather is almost like a baby now, dear. Isn't that right, Richard? We need to take care of him like we take care of a child." Daniel, who was serving the drinks, intervened timidly. "Carol, please." "Please what, Daniel? I'm just stating facts. Your father can barely use a remote control. He's practically a baby with wrinkles." Richard, playing his role, just smiled sadly and began to eat the bland paste on his plate, while Carolina cut herself a succulent piece of turkey. What she didn't know was that very morning, Richard had signed the acquisition of an additional 5% of Silverstone through an offshore holding. His total stake now reached 28%. Enough to, with strategic allies, take control if necessary. With each humiliation, Richard strengthened his position. With each insult, he consolidated his power in the shadows. His silent empire grew in the same proportion that his public image diminished. It was in March of 2020, with the pandemic beginning to transform the world, that Richard identified the first concrete evidence of Carolina's crimes. Marta, his assistant, brought the documents to the penthouse where Richard was working remotely. "So we found something in the Western Division contracts. Duplicate signatures, ghost suppliers, markups of up to 200%. Richard examined the documents carefully. "And who signed these approvals?" "The Director of Special Projects, Carolina Mendez Alvarez." That night, for the first time in years, Richard allowed himself a genuinely satisfied smile. The pieces were starting to fit together. Patience, after all, was his greatest virtue. The fall of the mask. The trigger April of 2021. The world was experiencing the second year of the pandemic. Richard, now officially in the risk group due to his age, had minimized his visits to his son's house, maintaining contact mainly through awkward video calls, an additional element in his characterization of a technologically incompetent elderly man. That Sunday afternoon, however, he had received a message from Daniel. "Dad, we need to talk in person. Can you come for dinner today?" Upon arriving at the mansion, Richard immediately sensed the tension in the air. Daniel seemed to have aged a decade. Sophia ran to hug him as always, but Lucas kept his distance, his eyes red from recent crying. "Grandpa, I don't want you to—" "Go away," Sophia whispered during the hug. Before Richard could question, Carolina entered the room, formally dressed despite it being a Sunday family dinner. "Richard, I didn't expect you to arrive so early." Her voice was cold, calculating. "Traffic was better than usual," Richard replied, already calculating possible scenarios for that reception. Dinner proceeded in uncomfortable silence. The children barely touched their food. Daniel was drinking more wine than usual. Carolina constantly checked her cell phone. After dessert, Carolina finally put her phone on the table and looked directly at her father-in-law. "Richard, we need to discuss your situation," Daniel interrupted. "Carol, maybe we can do this another time." "No, Daniel, we've postponed this too long." She turned to Richard. "With the pandemic, we need to reduce our expenses. Your monthly allowance is weighing on our budget." Richard perfectly feigned surprise. "Allowance? But I don't receive anything from you, dear." "Don't play dumb. The $300 a month we send to supplement your retirement, the medical bills we pay, the meals we send." Richard frowned, appearing confused. "But Carolina, I never asked for any of this. My retirement is modest but sufficient." "Sufficient? You can barely pay the rent for that tiny apartment." Carolina raised her voice. "Anyway, we can no longer afford this. And there's another issue. Your constant visits disrupt our routine." Daniel, visibly uncomfortable, tried to intervene. "Carol, my father hasn't been here for weeks. It doesn't matter. When he comes, he causes disruption. The children get agitated, you get distracted from work." She took a deep breath, as if seeking patience. "Richard, let's get to the point. We need you to consider a retirement home." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sophia began to cry silently. Lucas abruptly stood up and left. "A retirement home?" Richard repeated, his voice trembling not from anger, but from perfect acting. "Yes, we've already researched some affordable options. Your retirement should cover most of the costs." Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Dad, it's not quite like that. We just think you'd be safer with professional care." Carolina cut him off. "Don't be a hypocrite, Daniel. You agreed to this last week." Richard looked at his son, who couldn't meet his gaze. At that moment, something changed inside Richard. The mask he had sustained for 8 years began to weigh too much. "I understand," he said simply. "Good that you understand. Carolina responded with false sweetness. We can arrange the move for next month. Meanwhile, I think it's best we reduce visits. With the pandemic and everything. Richard rose slowly, leaning on the cane he carried, as part of his characterization. May I say goodbye to my grandchildren? Sophia is already saying goodbye. Lucas is indisposed. Carolina checked her watch. It's getting late, Richard. Daniel can call a taxi for you. It was at that moment that Richard felt Sophia hugging his legs, tears wetting his pants. Grandpa, don't go to the old people's home. You can stay in my room, I don't mind sharing. Richard felt something break inside him. It wasn't just the personal humiliation. It was seeing the suffering of that innocent child, manipulated in a game of power and cruelty. Carolina pulled Sophia abruptly. Go to your room. Don't be dramatic. The girl tried to protest, but her mother's look silenced her. With one last, desperate look at her grandfather, she went up the stairs. I think it's time for me to go, Richard said, his voice now different, firmer, deeper. Daniel hurried to accompany him to the door, while Carolina remained in the room, already on the phone with some work contact. At the door, Daniel tried to explain himself. Dad, it's not what it seems. Things are difficult. The pandemic affected my projects. We depend on Carolina's salary. Richard faced his son for the first time without his mask of fragility. His eyes, previously clouded by false confusion, now shone with clarity and purpose. Daniel, how long has it been since you designed anything? His son stuttered. Well, with the office closed. No. How long has it been since Carolina began interfering with your career? Since your contacts mysteriously disappeared? Since promised projects went to competitors? Daniel turned pale. How did you... Son, after today, many things will change. Richard straightened his shoulders, abandoning the hunched posture he had maintained for years. And when it's all over, you'll have a choice to make. Before Daniel could respond, Carolina appeared in the hall. Still here, Richard? The taxi must be waiting. Richard turned to his daughter-in-law, his eyes now completely different, cold, calculating, powerful. You know, Carolina, your mother called me last week. Carolina frowned. My mother? She can barely use a phone. Curious you should say that. She told me the same thing about you. Richard smiled. A smile that Carolina had never seen before. She also said that you were fired from the bank where you worked before, Silverstone. Something about accounting irregularities. Carolina's face paled. What are you talking about? This is absurd. Is it? Then why was your former supervisor at Silverstone, Thomas Mendes, transferred to the international office right after questioning some of your signatures on Western Division contracts? Daniel looked confused from one to the other. Carol, what is he talking about? Carolina quickly regained her composure. Your father is delusional, Daniel. Thomas was promoted on merit, and there was no irregularity whatsoever. Richard nodded slowly. Well, that's something we'll find out soon, isn't it? He walked to the door, now without any sign of the cane. By the way, don't worry about my monthly allowance. I believe soon it will be you needing assistance. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Oh, and Carolina, that extraordinary board meeting at Silverstone next week, I wouldn't miss it. For anything. The door closed, leaving behind a confused Carolina and a stunned Daniel. Outside, Richard breathed deeply the night air. 8 years of acting had ended. The mask had fallen. It was time for Richard Alvarez to resurface in all his fullness. His luxury car, parked a few blocks away, not the old Corolla he used to visit his son, Richard made a call. Marcelo? It's Richard. Execute Protocol Phoenix. Immediately. The siege closes. The next morning, Monday, Carolina arrived at the Silverstone Mining Group office as always. 8:15 sharp, premium coffee in hand, high heels echoing on the marble floor. As Director of Special Projects, Her office was on the 18th floor, with a privileged view of the city's financial center. As she walked down the main corridor, she noticed something different. Employees who normally greeted her effusively seemed to avoid her gaze. Her secretary, Sandra, seemed nervous when she saw her approach. "Good morning, Sandra. Any news?" "Good morning, Mrs. Alvarez. Yes, there was a change in your schedule. Dr. Ribeiro requested your presence in the main meeting room at 9. Carolina frowned. Marcelo Ribeiro, the majority shareholder and CEO of Silverstone, rarely called meetings without prior notice. About what? He didn't specify, ma'am. He just said it's urgent and confidential. Carolina entered her office, closing the door with more force than necessary. Something was wrong. First Richard's strange insinuations the night before, now this sudden summons. Coincidence? At 8:55, she headed to the meeting room. Upon arrival, she froze at the door. The huge oval table was almost completely occupied. Directors, executives, corporate lawyers, and at the head, Marcelo Ribeiro. Next to him, an empty chair and another occupied by a man with his back turned, grey hair, impeccable suit. "Carolina, please come in. We were waiting for you." Ribeiro's voice was formal, distant, very different from the friendly tone he normally used with her. Carolina advanced hesitantly, her eyes fixed on the mysterious man. When he turned, her blood froze. Richard Alvarez, but not the Richard she knew, or thought she knew. This man radiated power, confidence, authority. Nothing about him resembled the fragile, dependent father-in-law. "Please be seated," Ribeiro continued. This extraordinary board meeting was called to address serious corporate governance issues. Carolina sat automatically in the empty chair, her mind trying to process what was happening. "For those who haven't met him personally yet, I present Richard Alvarez, our founding shareholder and board member for over 15 years. The murmurs in the room were immediate. Carolina felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "Founding shareholder?" She stammered, looking at Richard. He smiled cordially. "Yes, Carolina. I own 28% of Silverstone Mining Group's shares. I thought you knew, considering your intimacy with corporate matters." Ribeiro cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's get to the point. Over the past 12 months, we conducted an internal investigation after identifying significant discrepancies in Western and Southern Division contracts. This investigation was confidential so as not to compromise the evidence. One of the lawyers distributed sealed folders to everyone present. What you are receiving is an executive summary of the findings. Please take a moment to review." Carolina opened her folder with trembling hands. Right on the first page, she saw copies of contracts with her signature, contracts that had been manipulated, values adulterated, ghost suppliers. Page after page of meticulously organized evidence. This is absurd. A fabrication," she exclaimed, her voice betraying her panic. Richard spoke calmly. "Fabrication, Carolina? Like the $78,000 diverted in the Maracana project, or the $52,000 in false travel reimbursements, or perhaps the $113,000 in contracts with Horizon Services, which curiously belongs to your second cousin." Carolina looked around, seeking allies, but found only looks of shock or contempt. "You don't understand," she tried again. "These contracts were all approved by the legal department. If there were irregularities, it wasn't me who—" "Carolina," Ribeiro interrupted. "We have email records where you pressure legal department members to approve documents without due diligence. We have testimonies from 3 managers who were threatened with dismissal when they questioned your practices. And we have," he glanced briefly at Richard, "evidence of your attempt to access financial control systems outside your scope of work." The room was spinning around Carolina. How was this possible? How had they discovered everything? And how, in the name of all gods, was Richard involved? "I should presume," Richard said softly, "that you're wondering how your useless father-in-law, that senile old man who can barely tie his own shoes, is sitting at this table." The silence in the room was sepulchral. "For 8 years, Carolina," I observed, "every insult, every humiliation, every manipulation, not just against me, but against my son and my grandchildren. I could have exposed you at any time, but I wanted to understand how far your greed and cruelty would go." "This is madness," Carolina whispered. "Does Daniel know about this? About this farce?" "Daniel knows nothing," Richard replied. "Neither about my involvement with Silverstone, nor about your crimes." "But he will. Today," Ribeiro intervened. "Gentlemen, let's return to the main issue. Given the evidence, I propose the immediate dismissal of Mrs. Carolina Mendez Alvarez for cause, followed by civil action to recover the diverted amounts, estimated at $391,000. The vote was quick and unanimous. "Carolina," Ribeiro continued, "security is waiting to accompany you to your room, where you can collect your personal belongings. Your badge and access to systems have been deactivated. Your presence on company premises after today will be considered trespassing." Carolina stood up, her legs wobbly. "You can't do this. I built vital projects for this company. You stole from this company," Richard interrupted her, now standing, "just as you tried to steal my family's dignity. The difference, Carolina, is that money can be returned. Dignity we'll have to rebuild." When security entered to escort her, Carolina looked at Richard one last time. "Why? Why maintain this farce for so long?" Richard approached, his voice low. "Enough for only her to hear. Because you needed to show who you really are, Carolina, not just to me, but to everyone, and especially to Daniel and my grandchildren." Immediate consequences. The news spread like wildfire. Before Carolina even reached home, rumors were already circulating in the financial market about her dismissal for fraud. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Curious colleagues, economic journalists, even former subordinates wanting to confirm the story. As she parked in the mansion's garage, Carolina tried to organize her thoughts. She needed to control the narrative. With Daniel before he found out from others, she needed to ensure her version prevailed. She found him in the living room, eyes fixed on documents scattered on the coffee table. Beside him, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "Daniel, we need to talk. Something terrible happened today." He slowly raised his eyes, red eyes, but strangely clear. "About you being fired for fraud? Or about my father being one of the owners of the company where you worked?" Carolina froze. "How did you—" Daniel raised an envelope. "My father was here. He brought documents, Carolina, many documents." "Daniel, don't believe this. Your father is manipulating you. He always hated me, always wanted to separate us. These," Daniel pointed to a stack of papers, "are your emails to construction company directors. Emails where you describe me as incompetent, where you suggest that my projects be accidentally overlooked. This is fabricated. Your father has money. He can forge anything." Daniel picked up another document. "And this is the complete Silverstone. Investigation, contracts, diversions, threats to employees, all documented, Carolina, all signed by you." Carolina sat down, her legs giving way. "You don't understand. I did what I had to do for us, for our family." "Our family?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You humiliated my father for years. You manipulated our children against their own grandfather. You sabotaged my career to make me dependent on you. What kind of family is that, Carolina?" At that moment, Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs. His eyes, so similar to his grandfather's, were fixed on his mother. "Is it true, Mom? Did you steal money? Did you lie about Grandpa?" Carolina stood up, extending her hands to her son. "Lucas, darling, it's complicated. Adults sometimes need to do difficult things to what?" Sophia's voice emerged behind her brother. To buy expensive purses, to make us ashamed of Grandpa. Daniel intervened. Children, go to your rooms, please. Mom and I need to talk. No, Lucas quickly descended the stairs. I'm tired of lies. Grandpa told us everything today. How you treated him, how you stole money, how you made Dad feel like a failure. Carolina felt the world crumbling. Your grandfather came here, talked to you. Sophia, still at the top of the stairs, was holding something in her hands, the magnetic blocks that Richard had given her years ago. Grandpa said, you're not a bad person, Mom, just a person who forgot how to truly love. Those simple words, spoken with the innocence of a child, hit Carolina more deeply than any accusation. Daniel again asked the children to go upstairs. When they were finally alone, silence weighed between them. Silverstone's lawyer called. Daniel finally said, they want $391,000 in restitution plus moral damages. We don't have that money, Carolina responded mechanically. No, we don't, because you've already spent most of it on your extravagances. The rest is in accounts that were frozen today. Daniel stood up, pouring himself another shot of whiskey. My father offered financial help. Not for you, for the children. And me. And you accepted. After all this manipulation. Manipulation. Daniel laughed humorlessly. The only person manipulating all of us for years was you, Carolina. My father just protected himself, and us, the way he could. He took a deep breath before continuing. I want a divorce. In the weeks that followed, the family's life transformed completely. The mansion had to be put up for sale to cover part of the debts. Carolina, now persona non grata in the corporate market, accepted a temporary job as an independent consultant with a salary 70% lower than her former one. Daniel, with his father's discreet help, began to rebuild his career as an architect. Projects that had been mysteriously shelved resurfaced. Lost contacts began answering his calls again. Richard Alvarez, now publicly recognized as the influential businessman he had always been, remained present in his grandchildren's lives, but distant from his son's marital problems. His only requirement was clear. The children would have unrestricted access to their grandfather without Carolina's interference. One afternoon, 2 months after the revelation, Richard met with Carolina at a neutral cafe, away from the children and Daniel. Why did you want to see me? She asked, her once confident eyes now opaque and defeated. To understand, Richard simply replied. To understand why someone with your talent and intelligence chose the path of dishonesty and cruelty. Carolina looked out the window, observing the light rain falling. You wouldn't understand. Try me. After a long silence, she spoke. I grew up with nothing, Richard. Literally nothing. My father was an alcoholic. My mother cleaned 3 houses to feed us. I promised myself I would never be poor again, never be weak again. And that justifies what you did? The thefts, the manipulations? No, nothing justifies it. She met his eyes for the first time. But when I met Daniel, I saw my chance for stability. I thought you were rich, that we could inherit, build the life I dreamed of. When I discovered it wasn't quite like that, I despaired. Richard observed her carefully, and the hatred, the humiliations. Why treat me that way? Carolina laughed bitterly. Because you reminded me of my father, the attentive, observant look, the way you seemed to see through me. I hated that. I hated feeling like I was constantly being judged. I never judged you, Carolina. I merely observed you. Richard sighed, and what I saw was a brilliant woman wasting her potential with greed and resentment. And now, have you come to offer redemption? The sarcasm in her voice was evident. No, I came to offer clarity. Your actions have consequences. Some of them, like the broken trust of your children, will take years to rebuild. Others, like lost, Dignity depend entirely on you to recover. Richard stood up to leave, but paused beside her. You know what saddens me most, Carolina, that you really had the potential to be extraordinary, without cheating, without manipulating, just on your own merit. As he walked to the exit, he heard her voice, now choked. Will they ever forgive me, Daniel, the children? Richard turned one last time. That depends exclusively on you. On the Carolina you choose to be from now on. Reconstruction and Legacy 5. Years later, spring of 2026, Richard Alvarez, now 73, watched his grandchildren playing in the garden of Daniel's new house. Sophia, at 15, patiently explained a geometry problem to Lucas, 19, who was preparing for college admission exams in engineering. Mathematics was never my strong suit, Lucas laughed, messing up his sister's hair. Maybe because you spent more time with your video games than with books, Sophia responded, pushing her brother's hand away with a smile. Richard smiled, remembering how those children had changed over the past 5 years. The family transformation had been profound, sometimes painful, but necessary. Daniel approached, bringing lemonade. At his side, Helena, the nurse he had met 2 years earlier during a hospital project he had helped design. Their marriage, 6 months ago, marked a new chapter for everyone. Dad, Helena and I are thinking of expanding the house, adding a special annex. Another bedroom? Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. Helena smiled, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat belly. We haven't told the children yet, but in 7 months the family will grow. Richard hugged his son and daughter-in-law, genuinely happy for them. Daniel's life had changed radically after the divorce. The first months were chaotic, financial problems, custody battles, the children's adaptation. But over time, he rediscovered his passion for architecture, rebuilt his self-esteem, and finally opened his heart again. And Carolina? Richard asked after Helena moved away to call the children for a snack. Daniel took a deep breath. She's adapting to the idea of being a grandmother. He paused, seeking the right words. She's changed, Dad. Not completely, maybe she'll never change completely, but she's trying. After the Silverstone scandal, Carolina faced hard times. The debt, the destroyed reputation, the loss of primary custody of her children. For almost a year, she sank into bitterness and self-pity. It was only when Lucas refused to visit her for 3 consecutive months that something awakened in her. Carolina sold her city apartment and moved to a small town in the countryside, where she opened a modest cafe. Away from the corporate world and its temptations, she began to rebuild not just her life, but her identity. She called me yesterday, Daniel continued. She wanted to know if she could come next weekend. Said she has a gift for Lucas. Something related to university. Richard nodded. His relationship with his former daughter-in-law was cordial, but distant, exactly how he preferred it. Does she know about Helena? Yes. Surprisingly, she was genuinely happy for us, Richard observed. The grandchildren helping Helena serve the snack. Sophia had inherited his affinity with numbers. Lucas, his silent determination. Both had gone through fire and come out stronger, like refined gold. You know, Dad, Daniel said after a moment of silence. For years I wondered if you hadn't been too cruel, exposing Carolina that way, allowing everything to collapse so publicly. Richard turned to his son, his eyes reflecting decades of experience. The cruelty would have been to allow you all to continue in that farce, to let your children grow up believing that humiliation and manipulation are acceptable forms of relationship. Daniel nodded slowly. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you had revealed everything earlier, years earlier. And I think about what would have happened if I had never revealed it. Richard placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Time is the only tool we truly possess, Daniel. Using it wisely is the greatest challenge. That night, after the family dinner, Lucas asked to speak with his grandfather privately. In Daniel's office, the young man seemed nervous, restless. "What is it, my boy?" Richard asked, recognizing in that restlessness the same behavior that Daniel exhibited in adolescence. "Grandpa, I'm thinking of changing my career choice." Richard raised his eyebrows. "I thought engineering was your passion." "It was, is, but—" Lucas took a deep breath. "I want to pursue business administration. I want to understand how businesses work, how to build something lasting." A discreet smile formed on Richard's lips. "May I ask what inspired this change?" Lucas looked directly into his grandfather's eyes. Your story. How you built everything. From scratch. How you protected what you valued." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "And also how Mom almost destroyed everything with greed. I want to understand both sides, how to create and how to protect." Richard felt a mix of pride and concern. "Administration is an excellent path, Lucas. But remember, the most lasting empires are built on integrity, not on fear or power." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "Grandpa, there's a question I've wanted to ask for years, but never had the courage." "Ask." "Why did you wait so long? Why did you endure the insults, the humiliations for 8 years? You could have exposed Mom much earlier." Richard leaned back in his chair, pondering. This was a question that many had asked, Daniel, his partners, even Carolina. Because it wasn't just about justice, Lucas. It was about truth, deep truths that needed to emerge naturally. "What truths?" "About your mother's character, which needed to be revealed without my interference. About your father's inner strength, which needed to be rediscovered, not imposed. About you and Sophia, who needed to see reality for yourselves at the right time." Lucas processed those words slowly. "So it wasn't just revenge. Revenge was a consequence, not the goal." Richard smiled slightly. "Although I must admit there was a certain poetic satisfaction in your mother's fall." The young man laughed, an open, genuine laugh, so different from the forced laugh he displayed in the times when Carolina dominated the house. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." Richard watched his grandson leave the office, his chest filled with a feeling that transcended pride. It wasn't just the continuity of his material legacy that satisfied him. It was the transmission of values, principles, of wisdom, hard-won. The price of dignity. September of 2026. Richard received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Alvarez, this is Dr. Mariana from Santa Clara Medical Center. Carolina Mendez is hospitalized and asked us to contact you." Richard frowned. "Carolina is sick." "She suffered a minor stroke. She's stable, but insisted on speaking with you, said it's important." After a moment of hesitation, Richard agreed to visit her. He informed Daniel, who was already on his way to the hospital with the children, and headed there in his own car. In the hospital room, he found a Carolina very different from the imposing woman he had known. Thinner, hair now naturally grey, eyes without the calculating hardness of before. "Richard," she said with a weak voice when she saw him enter. "Thank you for coming." He approached the bed. "Daniel and the children are on their way." "I know, but I wanted to talk to you first." She gestured for him to sit. "The doctors say it was a warning, that I need to reduce stress, take better care of my blood pressure." "I'm sorry about your health, Carolina." She smiled weakly. "You don't need to be polite. I know you don't feel sorry." Richard held her gaze. "What do you want from me?" Carolina looked at the window, at the blue sky beyond the glass. "In the Last 5 years I've thought a lot about what happened, about who I was, about who I became. And did you reach any conclusion? Yes. She turned to him. You were right. Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised by the admission. Not about everything, she continued, but about the essentials. I had the potential to be extraordinary without cheating. I had intelligence, determination, vision, but I chose the easier and more destructive path. He nodded slowly. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that I understood the lesson. I took my time, I resisted, I grew bitter, but I finally understood. She took a deep breath before continuing. And because I need your forgiveness. Richard hadn't expected this. My forgiveness? I know it seems strange, after everything, but I need to close this chapter. I need to know that despite everything I did to your family, you don't hate me. He observed her carefully, looking for signs of the old manipulative behavior. He found none. I don't hate you, Carolina. I never did. I disapproved of your actions, protected my family from your manipulations, but hatred requires an emotional investment that I never dedicated to you. She laughed softly. Always direct, aren't you? It's one of the things I secretly admired about you. A comfortable silence hung between them, something unthinkable years before. Can I ask you a question, Richard? One that has always intrigued me? Ask. That night, when you expelled me from the house, why mention the Silverstone meeting? Why give me that warning? You could have left me completely in the dark, make the humiliation even greater. Richard reflected for a moment. Because dignity isn't something we take from others, Carolina. It's something we offer or preserve. Warning you was my way of saying, choose how you want to face this, with dignity or without it. I didn't choose. Well, she admitted with a sad smile, no, but you're choosing better now. The door opened and Daniel entered with Lucas and Sophia. Richard stood up, giving space to the family. Before leaving, Carolina called him again. Richard? He turned. Thank you. Not for forgiving, but for teaching, in the hardest way possible, but necessary. Richard nodded and left, leaving Carolina with her son and grandchildren. In the hospital corridor, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The revenge he had planned for years had brought justice, but also unforeseen consequences. Fractured families, traumatized children, lives irreversibly transformed. The price of dignity was high, but in his heart he knew it had been a necessary price. The silent legacy December of 2026. In the living room of his penthouse, Richard Alvarez observed the city illuminated for Christmas. At 73, he felt the weight of years and the decisions he had made. The intercom rang. His security announced the family's arrival. Moments later, the room filled with voices and laughter. Daniel and Helena, Lucas and Sophia, and to his surprise, Carolina. We hope you don't mind, Daniel explained. We thought that for the first Christmas with the baby on the way, we should try a new beginning, all of us. Richard observed Carolina, who seemed uncomfortable but determined. She held a package wrapped in gold paper. For you, she said, extending the gift. A thank you, in a way. Richard opened the package carefully. Inside, he found a handcrafted photo album. On the cover were the words, "The Silent Empire, a story of patience and redemption." Flipping through the pages, he saw old photographs of himself as a young teacher, images of his first investments, moments with Maria, Daniel's birth, and then, in chronological sequence, the entire saga they had lived, including newspaper clippings about the Silverstone scandal. I found these photos when emptying my storage, Carolina explained. I realized there was an entire life I never knew, a story I never respected. Richard closed the album, moved. It's a very meaningful gift, Carolina. Thank you. The evening proceeded in a silent truce, not exactly comfortable, but sincere. Lucas announced his acceptance to business school. Sophia shared her plans to pursue applied mathematics. Helena and Daniel revealed they were expecting a girl whom they would name Maria in honor of Richard's wife. When everyone was preparing to leave, Carolina asked for a moment alone with Richard again. "I have one last request," she said when they were alone. "What is it?" "Lucas wants to write about your story, about how you built your empire, how you protected your family, how you exposed me." She hesitated. "He asked my permission, which I found surprisingly respectful of him." "And you granted it?" "Yes, but I said we would need your approval too." She looked directly into Richard's eyes. "So, would you allow your story, our story, to be told?" Richard pondered for a moment. Why does Lucas want to tell this story? For revenge, for sensationalism? No, Carolina replied with certainty. He said he wants to tell it as a lesson about strategic patience, about unwavering dignity, about the consequences of our choices. Richard smiled slightly. "In that case, yes, I allow it, with one condition." "Which one?" "That it be honest, completely. Honest, about my flaws too, my doubts, my moments of weakness." Carolina nodded. "I'll do my best to ensure that." When everyone left, Richard returned to the window, contemplating the city that had witnessed his rise, his strategy, his revenge, and now an unlikely reconciliation. His empire was no longer silent. Soon it would be a known story, perhaps an example for others. Did that bother him? A little. Discretion had always been his preferred mode of operation, but there was something powerful in allowing the truth to fully emerge. Finally, he picked up the album Carolina had given him again, opening to the last page. There, a single recent photograph. Richard sitting on a park bench, Sophia beside him, with a math book, Lucas standing behind them, a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. And in the background, slightly blurred but visible, Daniel and Carolina, side by side but separate, observing the scene with complex expressions. Below the photo, a single handwritten phrase by Carolina. "To Richard Alvarez, the man who taught me that respect is not charity, but a requirement, and that some men have enough patience to wait years until that lesson is learned in the hardest way possible." Richard closed the album and smiled. His revenge was complete, but in a way he had never imagined. Not with Carolina's destruction, but with her transformation. Not with eternal suffering, but with learning and growth. The underestimated patriarch had finally revealed his power. Not just financial or strategic power, but the most fundamental power of all, that of changing lives, of teaching through example, of defending dignity at any cost. And that, Richard realized on that Christmas night, was the true empire he had built. Not of concrete and contracts, but of values and principles, an empire that would continue long after the buildings crumbled and the companies changed hands. A silent empire, but eternal.